I think that asking what caused the Civil War is the wrong question. And even some of your neo-abolitionist historians like Ken Stamp and Eric Foner have pointed out that there are really two separate questions. Why does the South secede, and why does the North refuse to let the South go?
So what was the beginning of his presidency like?
The beginning of his presidency is dominated by the secession of the Deep South. So
how soon after he was inaugurated?
Well, after he's elected, the Deep South secedes, with South Carolina being the first state, and then you have the Cotton States seceding.
Was he even inaugurated at that point?
No, he was not. That was right after the election.
I mean, that's incredible.
By the way, one interesting detail that a lot of people are unaware of, in South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession, and they're the first state, they're the most firebrand of all the secessionists. In their Ordinance of Secession, they do not, the issue they give the largest play to in terms of justifying secession is not Lincoln's election, but Northern failure to comply with the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. Now, partially that's a rhetorical ploy because it allows them to argue that the Northerners had violated the constitutional contract first, but it also reflects a deep concern about fugitive slaves, and one of the points that I make in my book is that I think most historians have underestimated the economic significance of the fugitive slave issue in terms of bringing on secession. And maybe we can get to that later.
No, I do want to get to that. So,
so you have the Deep South seceding, and they're seizing all of the U.S. military bases, except for a few that are holding out, and the prominent one that's holding out is Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. So James Buchanan has to deal with this. He's the lame-duck president. He tries to reinforce Sumter, and South Carolina fires on the ship, but the garrison is still there when Lincoln becomes president. So that's the big issue that's dominating Lincoln's presidency, is what do you do about Fort Sumter? And Lincoln, he's getting all kinds of advice. Some people want him to try to back down on the Republican position about slavery in the territories, but he absolutely refuses to do so. I mean, he has agreed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act as president. So this is the only anti-slavery issue, and he decides to hang on to it. Some want a more aggressive policy, some want a more passive policy. Basically, Lincoln essentially follows Buchanan's policy, although Buchanan gets a lot of criticism.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that.
And what happens is...
Well, Buchanan's policy being what?
Being trying to reinforce the fort, but not using military force to hold on to the fort.
Gotcha.
All right? So Lincoln sends reinforcements and supplies to the fort, telling the South Carolina that he's doing so. By this time, the Confederacy is formed. The Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter, right? And that's the 9/11 of the Civil War. It polarizes both sides. It polarizes Northerners, because up until this time, there are a lot of Northerners who say, well, we should let the South go in peace. Many of them think, well, if we let them go in peace, they'll come back. And at the time of Lincoln's inauguration, there's still more slave states in the Union than out of the Union. But Lincoln responds to the firing on Fort Sumter by calling out troops. And immediately, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas all joined the Confederacy. So it's the Great Divide. So with a stroke of the pen, he's doubled the size and the material resources of the Confederacy.
Yeah. What do we know about his thought process at the time?
Well,
was he really ready for the fallout that was going to happen?
Yes and no.
And then the escalation, obviously, that led to the war.
Yes and no. Let me back up a little and explain why he had to do this, all right? Why it was politically necessary to do this. Many of your abolitionists, particularly William Lloyd Garrison, who's one of my heroes, who was advocated immediate emancipation, full political rights for all African Americans. He was also a pacifist. An anarchist, a classical liberal in favor of free trade, free labor.
I got to do more on this guy.
His opposition to slavery, a lot of the radical abolitionists framed it as man-stealing, in terms of property rights. And he was also in favor of northern secession from the Union, because he saw the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. He denounced the Constitution, publicly burned a copy, and on the masthead of his paper, The Liberator, no union with slaveholders, graced it throughout from 1831 on up to the Civil War. And this was true of many of your most radical abolitionists. So basically what your abolitionists, and one of the reasons they were so unpopular is because they were saying you can't have anti-slavery in union. People are committed to the Union, right? So they're not happy about the abolition. The Republican Party, by reducing the anti-slavery issue to its lowest common denominator in the territories, is telling the public you can have anti-slavery in union. All right, well, once the Union's threatened, the Republican Party is going to have to suppress secession or face political oblivion. And in fact, even if Stephen Douglas had been elected president, he's an old hardline Jacksonian. If he had been elected president and the South had still seceded, now that's not very likely, but if he had been elected president and the South had seceded, he probably would have moved military force against the South even faster than Lincoln.
It's so interesting because I think one of the themes as we do this whole week is looking at these people through a 2018 lens. And when you hear that somebody didn't want full rights for people but wanted to free them, or they couldn't vote, or some of the other issues you're talking about, and yet at the same time you're saying, but the abolitionists actually weren't that popular.
Right.
It's like, to view these people through our lens today is really, it's a very slippery slope, because Lincoln had to do some things that perhaps in our lens now would have been viewed as very unfair to the African Americans.
Right, yeah.
And there he was. So okay, so the war begins, and he's a new president at war. Who is he getting advice from? Did he really understand how to
Okay, well,
do this?
the other part of the answer to your question is that Lincoln and many of the Republicans, and many Northerners in general, underestimated the enthusiasm for secession on the part of Southerners. They initially believed, that it was a Southern elite of slaveholders, almost a conspiracy that had brought about secession, and that's why they weren't prepared for the extent of the resistance of Southerners once Lincoln calls out troops.
Yeah.
And so once he calls out troops, then you have the problem of managing the war.
So there was really nothing he could have done at that point, even if there were voices, even if he internally felt, well, maybe we could just let them go, or if he had voices around him that were saying, it's all right, let them secede. It was too late, really, right?
Yeah, politically.
Yeah.
All right, politically. I mean, by that time, in the North at least, not in the Deep South, but in the North, liberty and union had become mystically identified as inseparable. And so that's, and in fact, right, this leads to the question of a more basic question of what caused the Civil War, right? And there's now a current trend to argue that slavery caused the Civil War, and not only did it cause the Civil War, but it was all about slavery, and that in fact slavery, the entire history of the Union up until that point is all about slavery.
Yeah, you disagree with this premise. I know that, so take it away.
I think that asking what caused the Civil War is the wrong question. And even some of your neo-abolitionist historians like Ken Stamp and Eric Foner have pointed out that there are really two separate questions. Why does the South secede, and why does the North refuse to let the South go? And the answer to the first question is definitely slavery. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming for that. There's probably hardly any historical causal explanation at that level of abstraction for which the evidence is more overwhelming. So the South secedes in order to protect slavery.
Okay, so that's the easy one.
But ending slavery is not what motivates the North.
Yeah.
What motivates the North is preserving the Union. And in fact, Lincoln, before the firing on Fort Sumter, endorses an original 13th Amendment, which is not passed, in which he's still holding to the position of opposing the extension of slavery in the territories, but this new amendment would protect slavery in the existing slave states and be unamendable. In the early days of the war, some of your Union commanders were returning runaway slaves. So the war, from the Union perspective, the suppression of secession is designed to preserve the Union. And Lincoln even later says if he could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, he'll do that. If he could preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, he'll do that. If he can preserve the Union by freeing some and leaving others enslaved, he would do that.
What was his real belief in the Union based in? Did he just truly believe that we had to remain one country, otherwise we would be in perpetual war? Is that really what it came down to?
He thought that the dissolution of the Union would lead to anarchy.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.